it's interesting that you were just sharing about the guy who was walking down the street and he was, screaming at the top of his lungs, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? Now, it's interesting, he says, what are we going to do? He wasn't just saying, okay, I've got to do something, but we have got to do something. So that means people have got to connect, but because now, like for example, the title of your book, When Loving God Is Not Enough, people have so many different ideas about who God is, what God is, and what that relationship entails. So if you could, I'll have to ask the question, well, what is or who is God? So that when we get into this, we have a backdrop.
We have to commit to using God's gift of abstract reasoning to solve our problems and to answer our questions. That's why we have minds. And too often people don't want to think because it's work. But it is the work. It is why we are here. All other creatures are governed by instinct, okay? They operate as they're divinely willed to operate based on programming. But human beings have been given the power of abstract reasoning because we are here to choose our existence. Our existence is made of choices. And we have to choose who or what God is. And in order to do that, you have to think about what you believe. You have to think about what you believe. You have to think about what you believe. And if it does not make sense to you, you have to think about what aspects of it do not make sense, why they do not make sense, and what would or will make sense to you about what you believe to be the force or entity that is creator and governor of the universe. So, who or what is God? Is God a being? Is God a being? There are psychological ramifications for believing that God is a being. What kind of being? A being is in a location. Where is that location? Where is heaven? Is that outside of you? Is it behind a cloud? Is it in outer space? What species is this being? Most of us have been engendered to believe that we were created in God's image. Does that mean God looks like a big human? What gender? Okay? Now, this sounds trite, but you have got to think about the question, what is God? And if it doesn't make sense to you, then you have to arrive at a decision that does make sense to you. Otherwise, how can you have a relationship? So, when we look at the psychological ramifications of God being a being, since we are who we are, that means God is separate and distant.
Yeah.
If we believe that God is a being, then God is separate and distant. What is the impact on your concept of yourself if you believe that which created and sustains you is a being far away, distant from you, looking down on your behavior? All right? I'm not answering that question for you. I want you to answer it for yourself. I want you to think about that answer. Because I submit that is one of the reasons why we see all this immorality and avarice and greed and violence out here. Because as children, we're told that God is a separate and distant being somewhere off in a place called heaven, looking down and watching our every move. And we often, in many religious texts, have stories about God's wrath, what God has done when people have transgressed against divine law. So subconsciously as human beings, when we do something, when we shoplift a necklace and get away with it, God must not have been looking. When we pick up the paper and read that such and such a CEO embezzled $42 billion from a company and gets a slap on the wrist or spends a year in a country club prison, he got away with it. And what does that do subconsciously to the human mind about the so-called wrath of God? Okay? So what I assert is, if you have the belief that God is a being that is separate and distant from you, what that does to your human mind is separates you from that being. and separates you from the laws of immediate cause and effect, which are always in action. And so subconsciously, Jawanza, we develop a disbelief in God.
Well, it's so interesting, Eraka, because even as you were sharing about thinking, that we need to think, we need to think, we need to think. Just that, the process of saying, I'm going to think about my concept of God, for many people, that's equated to a lack of faith, because we've been taught that faith, when you have faith, you don't question. And for many people, their religion, regardless of what religion they, ascribe to, it's like looking out of your bathroom window, and that's the only window that you ever look out. Then the view that affords you is, you could end up thinking
that becomes your world.
That
becomes your world. That's all you see. I want to offer that we should consider the creative force of the universe to be just that. God is a force, an energy, of which we are all part and parcel. God is not a being. I mean, that to me doesn't resonate as something that makes sense. And there are people who say, well, I know that. God is a spirit. I know that, But do you really know that? Do you really know that? Have you really sat with that? And if God is not a being, what is God? And where is God? People say God is in the trees. Okay. People say God is within you. Okay. What does that mean? Mm-hmm. Is it the same God that's in the trees, the same God that's in you? If God is in the trees, does that mean that recycling is the way we should worship? If God is within you, does that mean that human beings are divine? These are the kinds of questions we need to ask ourselves and arrive at personal answers so that we can determine for ourselves how it is we are going to love God and manifest God's will.
Sister, I want a copy of that book. Okay? I want a copy of that book. I want a copy of it.